More than a century ago, the U.S. government became concerned with the American male and wanted to reconnect them to their abilities of capturing and killing prey. Their answer was to populate streams, rivers, lakes with an entirely synthetic fish, the rainbow trout. Continuing today, these vitamin-supplemented fish are having devastating effects on certain areas. They are also glorified as a sports fish that help to sustain a multi-billion-dollar industry of hobby fishermen all over the world. Tonight, award-winning journalist, author, aquatic ecologist, and lifelong fisherman, Dr. Anders Halverson, will discuss the discovery of rainbow trout, their artificial propagation and distribution, and the interesting plans for this controversial fish. Please help me welcome Dr. Anders Halverson.
So, as Gina said, I'm going to talk about a book that I recently published called An Entirely Synthetic Fish, How Rainbow Trout Beguiled America and Overran the World. And I'll sort of give you some background on how I got going on this. I was working on my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I kept noticing that a lot of all of these environmental controversies that kept cropping up all over the place, there was always somebody, it always seemed to me that both sides had picked the science and were battling and using the science to fight their fight when they had really arrived at their positions based on some much deeper set of values, often unexamined even by themselves, and that they were just cherry picking or using the science to justify whatever position they had arrived at already. So I wanted to sort of take a closer look at that. And second of all, as Gina said, I grew up fishing in Colorado, and for some reason when I was a teenager, I just stopped fishing. I stopped picking up a rod, and I didn't really think about why at the time. And it occurred to me as I was sitting there pipetting away, sequencing DNA, I began thinking about it a little more, and it occurred to me that there's really a fundamental paradox in so much of, especially the freshwater fishing that we do today, which is to say, most fishermen, myself included, really look at fishing as a way to get away from civilization, a way to get away from industrialization, and get back to nature and sort of find a spiritual connection to the natural world. And yet, so often the fish that you're catching out there are very much a product of the industrialized society that we live in today. So these are just some examples that I came across as I started researching this book. This is, or was actually, the world record rainbow trout. And it's a triploid, so they've manipulated the number of chromosomes in it. It has an abnormal number of chromosomes so that it never sexually matures, so it puts all of its energy into growing. So that's 43 pounds. A couple of brothers up in Saskatchewan, or in Alberta, caught that in a lake called Lake Diffenbacher, and now they've caught an even bigger fish. And there was a really fascinating controversy that happened around that fish. There was a big debate online about whether it was could legitimately be called the world record rainbow trout since it was triploid. Which is, I think at the end of the talk tonight, you'll see what an interesting debate that really is. Over here on the left side is a fish at the University of Missouri where they're experimenting in feeding these fish creatine, which is the same bodybuilding supplement that Mark McGuire used in the Home Run Derby. And they say literally in the press release that they think fishermen will pay a premium for extra hard fighting fish. So you can go catch the Mark McGuire of rainbow trout if you want. And then here is a genetically modified, I had to apologize today, I showed this at lunch. That's a genetically modified rainbow trout. And notice the six-pack abs rippling down the sides there. Fish are not supposed to have six-pack abs. But that one's been genetically modified to knock out myostatin so that it continuously grows muscle. So that's from the University of Rhode Island that we get that one. And then there's this story from the Wall Street Journal from 1996, where Idaho found the fish that they were stocking into their streams weren't doing their jobs. So they were stocking them out there, and the fish weren't biting the hooks. And so they realized that these fish had been raised in the hatchery their whole life and were so used to eating pellets that they didn't know they were supposed to go out there and eat the worms that were being dangled in front of them. So they actually had to teach the fish to eat worms for a few weeks in the hatchery before releasing them into the rivers so that the fishermen would be satisfied. So there's all these sort of paradoxes out there. And I really decided, okay, I have to get to the bottom of this and see how do we get to this point. So I got this grant from the National Science Foundation to write a book about freshwater fisheries management. And it ended up being about rainbow trout for this very simple reason. We stock way more rainbow trout in this country than any other fish. In terms of pounds, we stock about 25 million pounds of rainbow trout, 100 million fish weighing 25 million pounds. So they're all these little catchable fish designed to be stocked out there and caught within a month or two. Most of the fish that the rainbow trout that are stocked these days die, 99% die within 3 months. So they're designed to be dropped in and pulled right back out again. And not only that, rainbow trout are ubiquitous. So actually, rainbow trout are native only to the Pacific Rim, actually, depending on your taxonomy, from northern Mexico up around the edge, California, Oregon, Alaska, all the way to Kamchatka. That's their native range, just a very narrow little band. But today you can find them in every continent in the world except for Antarctica. You can find them in every state in the United States, including Hawaii. You can go rainbow trout fishing for Hawaii in Hawaii if you want. Every province in Canada. There's famous fisheries now in Argentina, Chile, South Africa, New Zealand, all over Europe. Rainbow trout are everywhere. And they're not just there, they're not just physically there. They're a worldwide cultural phenomenon. So these are postage stamps from around the world. These rainbow trout are not native to any of these places. Here's one from New Zealand, Malawi, Oman, and that's a state in South Africa with rainbow trout. So rainbow trout, and you can find, as I'm sure you all have probably seen, rainbow trout oven mitts, rainbow trout, staplers, you name it, you can find rainbow trout on it. Any town in the West that you go into that has a fishing shop will have a rainbow trout out front. They were actually our state fish in Colorado up until 1994, even though they weren't native. They were the state fish in Utah until 1997. They're a worldwide cultural icon. In fact, in South Africa, there was some movement to start removing these rainbow trout for the effects they were having on the native fish there. And there was this massive backlash against it. So rainbow trout, there was this big movement to name them as an honorary indigenous fish of South Africa, so they could be considered native. Okay, so once again, how did we get to this point? It all goes back to the 19th century. And I like to start with this guy, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. So he was, of course, a Boston resident and a columnist in the Atlantic magazine. And in the last decades of the 19th century, we were undergoing this unprecedented industrial revolution that, for the purposes of this story, had two effects. One, it created massive wealth for a small segment of society that was sort of running the country, the Anglo-Saxons specifically, who were running the country. And two, it absolutely decimated the fisheries up and down the East Coast. So going back to point number one, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. and many others became very concerned about what their offspring were looking like. And Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. wrote, I believe this was in the Atlantic, that such a set of black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, paste-complexioned youth as we can boast in our Atlantic cities never before sprang from the loins of Anglo-Saxon lineage. I always take heart from that quote, actually, because I have kids, and of course, everybody's worried about the same thing today with video games, right? Well, they've been worrying about this for the last 150 years, if that makes you feel any better. Teddy Roosevelt actually famously wrote about race suicide. So there was a big concern that the offspring, the youth, were turning into these fops. And so what were we going to do about this? Well, the state of Vermont actually went to George Perkins Marsh to ask him that question. Marsh is this fascinating character. He wrote a biography of the camel. He wrote the first Icelandic English dictionary. He was Lincoln's ambassador to Italy, and he was a Congress member, among other things. And he's considered by many to be the founder of the environmental movement in the United States. Based on this book, he wrote Man and Nature in 1864, which was the first book to really address the impact that humans were having on the natural world. But before that, the state of Vermont asked him to write a report about what they should do about their fisheries that were in such decline. And he came to a similar conclusion as Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. He writes in this report that he wrote about the fisheries, he wrote, we have become not merely a more thoughtful and earnest, but it is to be feared a duller as well as a more effeminate and less bold and spirited nation. So, what to do about that? Marsh has this idea. He's got the answer. Just 15 years earlier, they had rediscovered how to artificially propagate fish. So his answer was, we'll artificially propagate these fish, stock them into the rivers up and down the East Coast. The boys will go out fishing again, they'll be manly, and democracy is going to be safe. And that idea sort of gets put on hold for a little while during the Civil War, but then it comes back with a vengeance thanks to Spencer Fullerton Baird, who was also actually a friend of Marsh's. So Baird was the head, or the assistant head of the Smithsonian at the time, and this was at a time when the federal government did not really fund science other than exploration and mapping. But somehow he was not only maybe one of the foremost naturalists of the day, he was politically extremely savvy. And he convinced Congress to fund this temporary one-year United States Fish Commission to examine what was going on with the scup off of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which were in deep decline. And he goes out and he does this, study, and he concludes that the scup are being decimated by the fish traps in the estuaries, and that the states will need to close those fish traps at least for several days a week to allow enough scup to get through to reproduce. And he goes to the states and he says, if you don't do that, the federal government is going to come in and force you to. So two things happen. First of all, there's a scup baby boom the next year, so it makes all of his conclusions look suspect. And second of all, the states laugh at him and they say, of course the federal government doesn't have the political will or probably the authority to do that. And so he has to concede both points. And so he's sitting there thinking about what to do. And a group of privates, so there was a group of people who had been privately culturing fish and selling them to the cities for restaurants. And they came to him and they said, listen, the federal government really needs to get involved in this. Start artificially propagating fish and stocking them throughout the waterways of the United States. And so he signs on, and Robert Roosevelt, who was Teddy's uncle and a Congress member at the time, pushes through funding for the U.S. Fish Commission to start artificially propagating fish. And within a year or two, it's completely taken over the Fish Commission, and the Fish Commission has become a permanent agency. Ultimately, the U.S. Fish Commission morphs into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This is the unfinished Washington Monument on the National Mall. And if you ever look on a map straight down sometime, you'll notice that the Washington Monument is off-center. It's not actually in a direct line between the White House and the Jefferson Memorial. And that's because just up here on the mall was a pond. And that was the first pond where they started raising these fish for the U.S. Fish Commission. The U.S. Fish Commission, it's been said, is one of the or artificially propagating fish was one of the first environmental movements, environmental fads in this country. And this is a horse-drawn wagon with these milk cans here containing fish fry that they are bringing in to put into this pond right here on the mall. They had a station on the mall called Central Station, and these are egg hatching jars back here. And here they are doing something with the eggs, and then they're going to raise them up to fry probably, or maybe not, maybe ship them out as eggs. And they ship them all over the country. So they designed these special fish train cars for carrying these fish around. And the railroads don't always let them go for free because the railroads wanted as many fish along their lines as possible because they wanted people to ride their trains. So they had this fish car, and anybody who requested fish could get them from the U.S. Fish Commission. The only catch was you had to send your request through your Congress member. And Baird specified that so that the Congress would be vitally aware of all of the constituents who were dependent on the U.S. Fish Commission. So you'd send this letter to your Congress member, he'd pass it on to the Fish Commission. They'd send you a telegram a day or two ahead of time saying, we're going to be in your area, be there. You'd show up with your milk cans, and they'd pour some fry in, and then you'd go drop them into whatever stream is nearby. And they did this all over the place. There was a huge movement at the time called the Acclimatization Movement. This is a worldwide movement to try to actually spread wild animals all over the world. It was really the French and the English who pioneered it with their colonies and their empires trying to spread these animals around. But it was a big movement here too. And the idea really was just to introduce as many species as possible. As one guy said with the fish specifically, let the best fish like the best man win. It was like the social Darwinism of ecology. Just spread everything as far as you can and we'll get the best outcome. So that was the idea. So they were trying to spread fish as far and wide as possible. So while I was working on this book, I became sort of fascinated with this guy, Livingstone Stone, who came from he's actually buried right over somewhere in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. He traces his line back to the Mayflower, and he was a minister in Charlestown, New Hampshire, not too far away. And for some reason, he gave up this nice, secure, stable job as a minister and took up fish culture and came down and visited Baird and convinced Baird that he should go to California to get Pacific salmon to bring back to stock the East Coast because, of course, the Atlantic salmon in the East Coast had been decimated along with everything else. We couldn't get Atlantic salmon from Canada because relations with Canada were at a low ebb at that point. So he says, let's go to California and get the fish there. So Baird agrees. So he heads out on 1872, 3 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. He gets on board, goes across the country, and ends up in Sacramento. And says, here I am to get these Pacific salmon, and everybody looks at him and say, well, there's no salmon left because they've destroyed their fishery as well because of hydraulic mining. So the hydraulic mining is when you get these big fire hoses and you spray down the sides of the rivers to wash all the sediment through these flumes, and you just take the gold out of it. There was so much hydraulic mining going on at the time that the bed of the Sacramento River was going up by 6 feet per year. There was so much sediment being washed into it. So finally, though, Stone finds some railroad engineer who says, I think I saw some Indians spearing salmon up north somewhere on the McCloud. So the McCloud is very remote at this point. There's no train going up there. So he takes the train north as far as he can, then he has to get off where they're still working on it. Gets on the stagecoach, rides the stagecoach as far as he can, gets off the stagecoach and walks. And sure enough, after he gets to the McCloud, he sees these salmon drying on the bushes, and there's an Indian camp right nearby. The only reason there's salmon left in the McCloud is because, first of all, there's not much gold in the McCloud, and second of all, the Wintu Indians have killed or driven off every settler who's tried to establish themselves on the McCloud. But somehow this demure minister from Charlestown, New Hampshire, convinces them to let him stay. So he and his 2 assistants set up a hatchery there. And there were some dicey moments. I mean, they were being threatened by the Indians, and there were all sorts of other dicey propositions. But somehow they managed to ingratiate themselves with the Indians and stick around and build this hatchery. And they sent, for 7 years, they sent salmon eggs and salmon fry back to the East Coast. And to this day, there's not a single run of Pacific salmon on the East Coast. It was a complete failure. Okay, so remember, Baird is politically savvy. He doesn't want to let this thing go. So what to do? Well, it turns out there's a group in New York. Robert Roosevelt and Seth Green have been experimenting with this fish that they got from a group called the Ornithological and Piscatorial Acclimatizing Society of California. So that society had set up to actually bring fish and game to California, but they had these rainbow trout in their streams, and they said, well, we'll send some to you if you want to experiment with them. So they shipped them back east to New York to Seth Green and Robert Roosevelt. And they experimented with them and actually found they were pretty good fish. And so Baird and Stone decided they should try some of these rainbow trout. So Baird goes upstream on the McCloud a little ways. There's Baird, not Baird. Stone goes upstream on the McCloud a little ways. There's Stone right there. One of these guys is his nephew, and one of them is the other assistant from Vermont. And they set up a rainbow trout hatchery. And they begin shipping rainbow trout back east, and rainbow trout quickly take over the sport fishing program of the U.S. Fish Commission. They're sort of the ideal fish. They fight hard, and remember, we're trying to create manly men here. They are hardy, so they can withstand temperatures and sediment in the streams in a way that the eastern brook trout can. And they're really easy to raise in hatcheries. They're sort of this ideal fish. So they quickly take over. And the Fish Commission sets up hatcheries all over the country. There's one in Leadville where they're probably raising rainbow trout. They've got hatcheries all over the country where they start raising rainbow trout and sending them all over the place. And it just gets bigger from there. At some point, they shifted over. I showed you at the beginning that we now stock them as catchables. So for the first few decades, they really were trying to stock them as fry and create these self-sustaining populations. Ultimately, this new metric was born called return to creel, and the idea was we need to, the price of the fish that's returned to the creel needs to be as cheap as possible. The economists got involved. And it looked like stocking things as fry was not as efficient as stocking them as catchable fish. There's a much better way to, or a much cheaper way to get fish into people's creels, assuming you don't want to just put them right there on their dinner plate for them. So I'm just going to read another little quote for you from California about how far this whole mentality went. So this is from a California fish commissioner in I think it's 1939 or so. Take, for example, a sunny Sunday morning in May. Mr. Los Angeles looks out of his window and for no good reason at all discovers that there's been a cloudburst on the desert the night before and there is water in the Los Angeles River. By 9:30 o'clock, 20,000 telephone calls have come to the Fish and Game Commission to come out and plant some fish because there is water in the Los Angeles River. Since we have one of the most efficient departments in the country, by 10 o'clock a truckload has started out. We carry a siren on the trucks, by which at the end of planting we let everybody know that the planting has been accomplished. By 11 o'clock the fish are caught out of the stream, and at noon the river has dried up again. So that's just sort of shows you the extent to which this stuff goes. And then to bring it even further, I'm going to flash forward now to 1962. So in 1962, Wyoming Game and Fish, Utah Fish and Game, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Fish Commission has at this point transformed itself into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, decide to poison 15,000 square miles in the southwest corner of Wyoming, to poison out all of the fish that are there so that they can introduce the rainbow trout that they're going to introduce won't face any competition or predation from any of these things. So just for perspective, 15,000 square miles is about the size of Connecticut and Massachusetts combined. Now the reason they got this idea is because the Bureau of Reclamation was planning to build 2 dams as part of the Colorado River Storage Project. They were going to build one up here at Fontenelle and one down here at Flaming Gorge. And these dams were going to really fundamentally transform that river. The Green River is really the headwaters of the Colorado River. And it was one of these traditional western rivers that had a massive flood in the spring, full of sediment, and then it was down to a warm little trickle by the end of the summer. But by putting these dams in, they would create a totally different river. They'd create this cold, clear, consistent, ideal trout stream. This is the Green River below Flaming Gorge Dam today. It's an incredible, it's a mecca for many fishermen. And this is the reservoir above the dam today. So they said, well, if Burec's going to do this to the river, let's create this ideal let's create a rainbow trout fishery here. It would be perfect. So being the naive biologist that I am, I heard about this incident and I wanted to investigate it. So I went to the library and went to the microfiche and started just pouring through the newspapers, expecting to find all sorts of stories about this. How could they there must have been a huge controversy about this. Couldn't find a single article anywhere in the newspapers about this incident. So I had to go back and look deeper and deeper, and finally I started finding the articles, and they were all in the sports section. And the only thing they said was the fishing's going to be really great in the Green River once the Fish and Wildlife Service gets done poisoning out all the trash fish. There was no controversy in 1962 about this incident. The only people who tried to stir up controversy was this guy, Robert Miller, and his father-in-law / PhD advisor, Carl Hubbs. They were 2 of the most eminent ichthyologists of the day, 2 of the first ichthyologists to really be interested in native fish. And so they tried to stir up controversy. They went to the Sierra Club. They went to the Ecological Society of America. They went to the newspapers. They went to the magazines. They said, we've got to stop this. This is a tragedy. They're going to destroy all of the native fish in Wyoming. or in this portion of Wyoming, and nobody was interested, nobody cared. It was out of sight, out of mind. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was meanwhile putting out these press releases talking about how, well, they would the operation itself was called the Green River Rehabilitation. They would write press releases about how terrible it would be if there was recontamination of the stream by native fish, for example. The entire mindset at the time, with the exception of very few people, was either it was a coarse fish or it was a game fish. That was the dichotomy, the dualism that they were living with. It was not this native, non-native thing that we have today for 99% of the country. So Miller and Hubbs fail to stop this project from going forward. So on September 3rd, 1962, I think it's September 3rd anyway, September 1962, they go ahead. So the poison they use is called rotenone, which turns the stream this sort of milky white color. So you can't see it very well, but there's a drip line going across the river there, and then here's the rotenone in these barrels here, and it goes through the drip line and drips down. And this was a 3-day operation, so there were dozens of drip lines spaced every 10 miles. So they would wait for the rotenone front to reach their drip line, and then they would turn on their rotenone. So there was this uniform front of rotenone moving downstream. Apparently it was quite a sight. There were thousands of fish in front of this front trying to escape this poison, getting pushed downstream. Interestingly, this picture here, they invited people to come gather the fish that were killed by the rotenone to bring them home for dinner. So this is somebody, as you can see all the rotenone out here. This is somebody out here picking up a fish to bring home for dinner. And rotenone is now used in labs to induce Parkinson's-like symptoms in mice. But it was a different mentality at the day. So there's someone collecting dinner right there. So for 3 days and 3 nights, they pour this rotenone into the river, killing all the fish. And at the end, it's a complete success. They've wiped out all or nearly all the fish in the river, along with, by the way, most of the aquatic invertebrates, because rotenone kills anything with gills, essentially. So it's a complete ecological clean slate. Now, they had planned this operation to coincide with the day when the Bureau of Reclamation was going to close the gates on the dam at Flaming Gorge. And the idea was that the rotenone would just pile up behind the dam and naturally get detoxified there. But the Bureau of Reclamation delayed the closing of the gates to November, at which point the water would have been too cold for the rotenone to be effective. And so Wyoming Game and Fish and Fish and Wildlife Service and Utah Fish and Game had to find another solution. And what they decided to do was to detoxify the rotenone by pouring in potassium permanganate, which would oxidize it. So they found this bridge just over the border into Colorado, in Browns Park, and they set up their barrels of potassium permanganate and the spreaders that they were going to spread this stuff all around. And all of a sudden, it was a complete disaster. A cold front came in the night that they needed to, as the rotenone front was reaching them. A cold front comes in, so there's wind whipping around and snow. The only way that they had to, or the best way that they had to determine how toxic the water was going downstream were these sentinel fish. So they would have a fish here in a cage. So you imagine some guy down here in the middle of the night in this windy snowstorm with a walkie-talkie, trying to look at the fish in the cage right here and radioing up to the guys on the bridge saying, oh no, more potassium permanganate, more potassium. So they didn't have enough potassium permanganate, it was the wrong consistency for the spreaders. Anyway, some rotenone gets downstream. And that's a big deal because 16 miles downstream is Dinosaur National Monument. So here's Dinosaur right here. Dinosaur has become hallowed ground for Americans because the Sierra Club, David Brower, and others had fought this campaign just a few years earlier to block the Bureau of Reclamation from building a dam there. And they had fought this really brilliant mounted this really brilliant PR campaign that really, was newspaper advertisements. And they convinced Americans that our national parks were our cathedrals, our national heritage, and that that they shouldn't be defiled by a dam. And not only are our national parks our cathedrals, but dinosaur is the central one that the battle is being fought over. So dinosaur is on everybody's mind already. And second of all, a few weeks after this operation was completed, Silent Spring was published. And Silent Spring was this transformative event in America that I don't think people are as aware of today as they might be. It's actually the 50th anniversary. She actually published the first article in June in the New Yorker. So we're almost right on the 50th anniversary when that began being published. And Silent Spring, of course, was about chemicals in the environment and the misuse and the overuse of chemicals in the environment, and absolutely had the country transfixed about that topic. And so this was this 1-2 punch. We've got our cathedrals being assaulted by these chemicals, and all of a sudden a controversy blows up over this event. Stuart Udall was the Secretary of Interior, Kennedy's Secretary of Interior. He'd been in office about a year at the time. And he has, remember, Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service under his purview. So they're going head to head, butting heads, writing these angry memos back and forth about this. So Udall commissions this report, and in the report he writes, from now on, whenever there is a threat to a unique species, that has to be the foremost consideration in whether we go ahead with the project. And maybe more important, those are big words for the time. No one's really written anything like that before. More importantly, he establishes something called the Committee on Rare and Endangered Wildlife Species, which is in charge of now compiling a list of all the endangered species that they can find in the United States. And that committee leads directly. There were actually 2 earlier iterations of the Endangered Species Act before the 1973 version that's in force today. So that committee leads directly to the first iteration of the Endangered Species Act in 1966, and thus to the second iteration, and finally to the 1973 version of the Endangered Species Act. And just to show you how things go full circle, we've now spent, under the Endangered Species Act, more than $100 million trying to restore 4 of the big fish that we were poisoning out in the Green River 10 years earlier. So, anyway, that's an interesting story. Rainbow trout led to the, I bet you didn't know rainbow trout were responsible for the Endangered Species Act. Okay, now I'm going to flash forward to the present day. Let's see, how much time do I have? So this is the Sierra Nevada, a lake up there in the Sierras. Absolutely gorgeous. If you haven't been up there, you need to get up there. It's stunning. John Muir called it the range of light, and you can see why. And there's thousands of lakes up there that are absolutely beautiful. And when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, they left these lakes devoid of fish. There were no fish in them. And the fish couldn't get up to them because there were these barrier waterfalls. So very few of these lakes had any fish in them. And consequently, this unique fauna evolved up there. Amphibians, invertebrates, everything evolved up there in the absence of fish. And then along came people about 100 years ago, and they look at this situation and they say, what an absolute waste. Here's all of these gorgeous lakes that are devoid of fish. And interestingly, it was John Muir was one of the big proponents of this. John Muir met Livingstone Stone at the hatchery on the McCloud, and then wrote about how important it was that we begin stocking the lakes of the Sierra Nevada with fish. He, of course, wanted to create a constituency for the Sierra Nevada, and saw fishermen as a good way to do that. So John Muir pushes the introduction of fish up there. Miners would bring fish up in their backpacks so that there would be some food around for them. They would bring them up on mules. And before long, they've got a few of these lakes stocked with fish. But it really gets rolling in the post-World War II. So post-World War II, we had a lot. This is Carroll Faced. He was a pilot in the Pacific during the war. And I talked to him, and he told me some great stories about this. So post-World War II, we had a lot of demobilized pilots coming home and a lot of surplus military aircraft. And these guys came back. This was the can-do generation, and they said, you know, this hauling fish up here in backpacks or mules. This is inefficient. We can do this a lot better. So they began doing these experiments. So the first experiment they did, they loaded some fish into these milk cans and took them up on that plane. That's a military surplus C-45. And took them up in that plane and shoved they just left them in the milk can and just shoved the milk can out the window trying to hit the hatchery pond down below. And they missed the hatchery pond down below, and they bounced along some rocks, and they circle around and land and go running over to this milk can, and there's 16 fish still alive in the milk can. So they say, shoot, if they can survive that, they can survive anything. So, but they do some more experiments. Because they want to know if they can fly all by themselves. So they gun the truck down the hatchery driveway, holding the fish up in the air, and plunk it back in the water, and sure enough, the fish can survive that as well. So they say, okay, let's do it. So they cut a hole in the bottom of this plane and begin dumping the fish out the back of the plane. And sure enough, within a few years, they have stocked almost thousands of lakes in the Sierra Nevada. It's a massively successful program for stocking these lakes. And in fact, it's ongoing today. Many of the Rocky Mountain states and California still stock from airplanes. I'm not sure whether they do that out here or not. Maybe someone else will be able to answer that. But it's still ongoing. Not only did they experiment with fish, by the way, just as an interesting aside, they also experimented with turkeys, pheasants, and the best of all, beaver. So they dropped beaver out of the plane to try to recolonize these areas. They had little parachutes and a little burlap bag. Okay, so the Sierra Nevada, all of a sudden, all of those lakes become full of fish. Now, 10, 15 years ago, they realized that these guys, mountain yellow-legged frog, which was indigenous to the area, are declining rapidly. And nobody knows quite why. And this is one of those episodes that made me think I got to look into this, because sure enough, everybody in the Central Valley, all the agricultural folks, are sure that the cause is the fish that have been stocked into the lakes. And all of the fishermen are absolutely sure, and they can show you the data, that it's pesticide drift from the Central Valley that's causing it, right? Everyone has their science on this side. So this guy decides to go do some experiments, and he convinces California to let him remove the fish from some of these lakes. And he has to use, by the way, drift nets, because California won't let won't let the agencies use rotenone anymore because of the fear about Parkinson's disease. Every other state in the country still uses it. It's a really interesting controversy. But anyway, he uses drift nets, and he has to lay these things out there for 3 years and catch all the fish out of these lakes. And sure enough, when he did that, he found it out that the mountain yellow-legged frog made a dramatic comeback. And not only that, it wasn't just the frogs. He's always very careful to point this out. It's not just about the frogs, that the entire system changes. So there's 100 times more mayfly biomass in these lakes once you remove the fish. As everybody can probably understand that rainbow trout love to eat mayflies, right? So you remove the rainbow trout, all of a sudden you've got this explosion in mayflies. And of course that can be really significant. They just put out other papers on the impact that has on the rosy-crowned gray finch and the bats, for example, that rely on these protein subsidies coming out of these lakes for feeding their young and for fattening up for the winter up here. They've got a very short season up here to get as much food in as they can. So the impact of these fish stocking in the Sierra has rippled throughout the ecosystem, probably in ways that we don't really fully even recognize yet. So that's just, so now you have, once again, things going full circle. You have California Fish and Game is now removing the very fish that they were stocking in 10 years earlier. This is a California Fish and Game employee removing a trout from a gill net that they stocked in probably only a few years earlier. So they're now actually trying to get these fish out of at least some of these lakes so that they can hang on to these, so that they can hang on to the mountain yellow-legged frog and ideally prevent them from being put on the endangered species list. And that's been a huge controversy in California, as you can imagine, because every lake is somebody's favorite lake to go fishing in. And they have to be very secretive about it as well, because their fear is it's very easy to sabotage this. All you do is you go to the lake next door, get some fish in a can, and you drop them right back into the lake where they've been removed, and 3 years' worth of effort is destroyed. Okay, and now I'll move to one other example of the impacts that this has had. So, rainbow trout, in addition to predation and competition with other native animals, rainbow trout hybridize. They're very closely related. The native fish to the Rocky Mountain region are the cutthroat trout. And rainbow trout and cutthroat trout are very closely related, so they can easily hybridize. So by stocking all of these rainbow trout into these Rocky Mountain streams, we've hybridized almost out of existence many of the cutthroats. The subspecies that had the widest distribution in the past was the west slope cutthroat. And this is just one example, but it's every subspecies has virtually the same story. Was the west slope cutthroat up here in Idaho and Montana. And depending on who you talk to, they're down to 2%, 20% or 2% of their native range because of the hybridization that's been done. So they've done this study. This is in the North Fork of the Flathead. That's what that picture was earlier. Glacier National Park was just on the other side though. All of the black dots on this map represent hybridized populations. And all of the white dots represent pure west slope, 100% pure west slope cutthroat populations. The only place where you can find a really, truly pure west slope anymore is in these high headwaters streams or in little streams that are maybe blocked off by a man-made culvert or something like that, so that the hybrids can't get up there. So you've got this really fascinating management conundrum all of a sudden. So first of all, these populations are so small that they're at risk of inbreeding depression and getting wiped out just because the inbreeding is so bad. The populations are so tiny. Second of all, there's probably different types of, different ecotypes, different genes that they would have, the fish up in these high headwater streams would have had compared to the west slope cutthroat that would have inhabited the main stem. You can imagine that it takes a different type of fish. And yet the only place now where you're going to find those genes that would have made the fish adapted to, the west slope cutthroat adapted to the main stem, are in the hybrid fish. So and the only way to save this inbreeding problem is to allow them to outbreed with other fish. So the hybridized west slope rainbows are at once the primary threat to the west slope cutthroat, and they're sort of their only hope of salvation. And so imagine trying to work that out if you're the guy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officer sitting there trying to evaluate this petition to list west slope cutthroats as an endangered species. What do you say? And there's been this ongoing controversy about, well, and it's really a sort of fascinating philosophical controversy that goes beyond the science. What is a pure west slope cutthroat, and why do we care? Does it, if it's 1% rainbow genes, should we count that as a west slope cutthroat? If it's 20%, does it count? Or does it have to be 0%, 100% pure? And at some point, there is some science to show that the really hybridized fish are less fit. They have fewer offspring than the pure west slope cuts. But really, I think it's a question of values as well as science. And why do we care about whether something is 100% pure? People are really duking it out. People have very strong feelings about that. So if you go up there, of course, Montana encourages you to keep the non-native rainbows and to leave the west slopes in the stream. But I convinced my wife, I somehow convinced her I had to go do some research, so I went up there to go fishing. And this is what you run into. You can see the cutthroat mark, but you can also see the rainbow trout spots down here. You wouldn't know that, but if it's got spots down here, it's generally a rainbow trout. So most of the fish that you catch in the main stem are hybridized fish. So it raises this really interesting issue. And so I like to sort of finish things off simply by noting there is this big push, and I'm a big believer as well in this, in trying to restore native fish as much as possible, but we're certainly never going to get rid of rainbow trout. And in addition, one of the things that I was struck by as I was working on this book was how similar the rhetoric is from the people who were pushing the introduction of rainbow trout 100 years ago. They were convinced that they were doing the right thing for the world. They were really helping the world by doing that. And it's so similar to the rhetoric you see today from people who are pushing to restore these non-native fish. And I think one of the real lessons is be humble about when you set out to try to engineer anything out there, because there's going to be unpredictable consequences no matter what we try to do, whether it's introducing rainbow trout or trying to restore the native fish. Okay, I'll wrap it up there and take questions.